Welcome to another episode of Afikra Conversations. Our special guest today is Professor Dina Rizk Khoury, who is a professor emeritus at George Washington University. Her books include State and Provincial Society in Ottoman Empire, Mosul, 1540 to 1834, as well as Iraq and Wartime, Soldiering, Martyrdom, and Remembrance, including her new book project, which we'll be discussing later on today, which is about statehood, nationhood, passports, and mobility all across the Ottoman Empire, specifically in the Persian Gulf, which I'm very excited to talk about. Dina, welcome to Afikra.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you and be talking to you.
So let me ask you a first question. As I mentioned, your first book focuses on a very particular time in the Ottoman Empire and in Iraqi history, which is the 16th to the 19th century in Mosul, which isn't, necessarily what every 15-year-old is interested in studying.
No, and and the book is definitely not a 15-year-old kind of book.
Yeah. So, give us a little context. How did you become interested in this, this period of time, and what was happening that struck your interest there and then?
It's very interesting because I started my graduate work at Georgetown as a refugee from the Lebanese Civil War. And most people who come and study from the Middle East, who come and study in the American Academy, end up choosing to study the country they came from. And I found talking and working on Lebanon, I was too close to it. And at that time, it seemed that Iraq, there were very few people working on Iraq. So I decided to work on Iraq, and I was working with a particularly interesting person who was very good, a historian of Iraq. So I chose Iraq. And I initially began, like a large number of people, wanting to do Iraq in the later period, in the 19th and 20th century, partly because I saw it as directly related to the 20th at that time century. But I found that the kind of questions that interested me were taking me further and further away from the later period. And they had a lot to do with the Ottoman Empire. And as I don't know if young school children now in the Arab world continue to be taught the history of the Ottoman Empire and the history of the Arabs and the Ottoman Empire as the origin of the backwardness of the Arabs lays in the fact that they were ruled by the Ottomans for such a long time, that until then they were doing fine. There was an Arab Renaissance, and it is the Turks who came and basically stopped the development of Arab society. And I found as I went back that in fact, this was not the case. And I chose Mosul in part because it was part of the Ottoman Empire that was critical to the trade and relations between Central Asia, Iran, and then Aleppo and the Levant. And it was a city that very few people had written about. So I chose it, and I found, and I did some research in Iraq and in Mosul, and I also did some research in Turkey in the Ottoman archives. And I found increasingly that we need to stop thinking of Ottoman society as basically a society dominated Arabs, and that Turks dominated Arabs. But that in fact, we need to think of the Ottoman project, political and social project, as a collaboration between people in the Ottoman lands who were Arabs, and in this case, what we think of as notables, like the Azm family. In this particular book, I study one particular family, the Jalili family, which were like the Azms in Damascus. And I find, and I study how, in fact, they become agents of the Ottoman Empire. They become Ottoman, and their power, and they become central to the maintenance of political power of the Ottomans. So that's basically the story of the book. It's the story of how this family became prominent, the sort of political alliances they struck in Istanbul, as well as within Iraq itself, in Mosul and Baghdad as well.
Okay, I have a bunch of different questions, but before I get to them, I want to ask you, why those dates? Why does this story start in 1540 and why does it end in 1834?
That's a very good question, Mickey. I think I begin in 1540, which is the date of the beginning of the effective rule of the Ottomans in the city of Mosul, in the province of Mosul. And it's a period that began what was known as the classical period of Ottoman rule under Suleiman the Magnificent, and established Ottoman legal norms across the empire. And it ends in 1834 with a large rebellion by cross sections of the Ottoman of the Mosuli population against a wali, a governor, who was an agent of the Ottoman state. And it ends at a time, and that rebellion led to the reconquest of Mosul and the establishment of what becomes a modern administration. So 1830s to the 1840s is this period of the birth of what we know now, the institutions of the modern Iraqi state. And the modern Ottoman state, and by extension, the Ottoman Iraqi state. It's basically pre-modern.
Yeah. Did the in 1540, when they assert themselves, if you can sort of paint the picture, I mean, are they rolling in with military force, or is it? I mean, whenever I think of this time and this, in particular, this region, it feels more like corporate America. Like, we are acquiring you, and that there's this value proposition, like you would be better for us to be managing this factory. I mean, what did it actually look like? 1540, at what point how do they actually acquire the right to administer this area?
That's a good question. We think of these powers as having tremendous military wherewithal. They're all powerful, but in fact, if an army conquers it, it's a relatively efficient army compared to what exists on the ground. But then, they, create these cadastral surveys that try to figure out. They're quite sophisticated by that. I mean, actually, they're the first cadastral surveys we have of what exists on the ground in terms of resources, and then they appoint a ruler, a wali, a governor that they choose from Istanbul. They send, and then they have a little bit of a small military garrison, and then they find allies. So you have to talk about these empires as a series of alliances with local allies that remain very fragile, and they're always perpetually changing. And that is why, in fact, people in Mosul and other Arab provinces actually get invested in this. They're benefiting, at least certain classes are benefiting from this. So empires are contracts, they're contractual agreements. So it's not a corporate takeover, and because it doesn't penetrate every single aspect of society or the economy. In fact, like contractual agreements. In fact, and the Jalilis themselves, these rulers for 100 years of Mosul, were military contractors. Think of, it's very interesting because the Americans go into Iraq in 2003 and use military contractors. So it was a very reminiscent of this very pre-modern way of power and exerting power in the Ottoman Empire.
So if I was in one of these social circles at the time, in the 16th century, 17th century in Mosul, and I was saying things like, this region is so faction. There is no shared identity between these major provinces, and we're not Ottoman and we're not Iraqi, although that term probably didn't make sense. Would people at the time look at me like, what are you even talking about? None of that even matters. We're a city, a city state or like a province, and who cares if we're connected to Baghdad and Basra and all these places? Like, it doesn't even matter.
It actually matters because, in fact, the province itself was not was not walled in, and the people who lived in Mosul were connected to people in Aleppo through and people in Baghdad through trade. There was a rich intellectual culture of scholars, particularly religious scholars and historians, who wrote these books by the 18th century that connected them to this intellectual legacy, this imagination, if you want, of a space that is an Ottoman state that is ruled by an Islamic empire that had been successful in expanding into Europe and fighting the Europeans and the Christian family. But also there were all these local patriotisms, and these local patriotisms, the sense of, I'm proud of my city, but I'm also proud of the connections I make with scholars in Aleppo or Baghdad or Damascus or even India, because there were Muslim scholars coming from India. So these are not self-contained units, but the identity was not Arab, certainly. It was Ottoman insofar as it got invested in this idea of an Islamic state that was ruled by the House of Osman. But there were also very much local patriotisms in each of these cities, whether we're talking about Damascus or Beirut or Aleppo or Baghdad.
So you said something earlier. You said like people have this sense, or part of your work was debunking this myth that our society and all of our ills come from not only the sort of most recent colonial past, but also the Ottomans ruling this region. And your research suggested otherwise. So just asking for a friend, where are the sources of our ills
coming from?
Of which we have no shortage.
No, it's an ever-ending question. In fact, at some point, as an Ottomanist, I have this nostalgia for the Ottoman Empire, particularly the nation states had not served us well at all, frankly, in the past. So the nation state as a project in the Middle East has been problematic, and some would say a failure at worst, but certainly problematic. So we have this nostalgia of a connected world where you can travel from Palestine to Lebanon to Syria to Iraq without borders,
Breakfast in Alexandria.
Yes, of course. That's the dream.
That's the dream. Okay, so at 1834, you gave us a sense of 1540, but 1834, what comes next? I mean, your work, when I read your bio, zooms to sort of the contemporary problems and challenges that people in Iraq are being faced with. But what comes next? Fill in some of the gap. What happens after 34 with this sort of project in this society? So
in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, the Ottoman Empire begins thinking of itself, increasingly trying to recreate itself as a modern state, with a modern bureaucracy and a modern army and modern educational system. And part of this involved actually an attempt to get away from this bargain that they had established of their rule. Okay, you grant us legitimacy, you accept our rule, you at least most try to obey us. and we have this contract. Now what they move into is what all modern states in Europe and they move into, which is, let's centralize the bureaucracy, let's create a rational bureaucracy, let's create a rational centralized political system. And they are successful in their success in doing this is uneven. And they're more successful in some areas than they are in others. But what happens in Iraq over the 1860s and also in other parts of the Levant is the setting up of these modern administrations and the creation of a local elite that's modern. So the idea of an Effendi. Yani, we all grew up with Haida Effendi, and it's derived from this class of bureaucrats that are created by the modern educational system and by the laying of railways, an attempt basically to modernize or create a modern infrastructure, both in education and in transportation and in administration as well.
What does the word Effendi mean, actually?
Effendi is, the guy with the fez that you see basically that's a caricature of, so one of the things they do in the Ottoman Empire is class distinction and rank distinction between different parts, different, estates in the Ottoman Empire, depended on what you wore on your head. What sort of hat you wore on your head. If you're an alim, if you're a janissary, and if you're a pasha, and so on. So one of the things that the Ottomans decided to do is basically change the headgear. And so the fez, which is really a Moroccan, the fez became the headgear that signifies this new bureaucracy.
You know that you're dealing with an empire led by bald men when
Yes.
Headgear is an essential feature of rank.
Yes, and it remains in a very interesting way, because when the monarchy came, when the modern monarchy in the Hashemite monarchy came into Egypt, into Jordan, and this is a monarchy from what is now Saudi Arabia, part of which ruled Jordan, and then another part ruled Iraq. And the first thing they thought about is, okay, we're getting rid of the Ottomans. Let's remove the fez. We'll take on another hat, which is the sidra, and it was only worn by a very small minority among the ruling elite.
So, I always hear about this dynamic of, the Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula, and in particular, in this case, the Hijaz, trying to de-Ottomanize the region and having this rebellion against it. To what extent is that overplayed?
I mean, if you're talking about, what we grew up with as young people, and even the way we wrote history in English and Arabic, was that there's this great Arab rebellion led against the Ottomans, led by the descendants of the Prophet, who ally themselves with the British and get false hopes with in 1915 that they would get an Arab state. Now, this is a project that was contracted in 1915, 1916, when it was very clear to a significant part of the Arab population that the Ottomans might be losing this war. And so there were all these options that they were examining and looking onto. That's not to say that there was not, beginning in the late 19th century, this project, okay, the Ottoman Empire is losing territory. It is going in the Balkans. It might actually disintegrate completely, what are our options? And they tried to figure out a large number of options in basically doing an Arab Ottoman Empire, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But when the Great Arab Revolt came, it had its supporters and its cadre who were at the officer corps drawn mostly from the Ottoman army. But a large number of people in the Middle East, whether we're talking about Syria or Palestine or Iraq, were very hesitant about joining it, in large part because the idea of being ruled by other entity other than an Ottoman and Islamic sultan was something very difficult to accept. And so it is only in 1917 when it becomes very clear that the Ottomans they might actually fall apart, particularly after the Russian Revolution, that there is more support, that the Arab Revolt gets a larger number of people to support it.
And also, I feel like from what from these interviews, there's an enormous amount of animosity and sort of acrimony that increases between the empire and in particular the minority populations. I don't know if that's true or you agree with that.
I mean, in 1915, there are of course the genocide. There is of course the genocide against the Armenians. So so the war for the Armenians was catastrophic. It wiped them out from Anatolia. But within the minorities of the Middle East, it's very difficult. I mean, except for Beirut, for Lebanon, that had a large Christian minority who had for some time been talking about projects of creating a state that is predominantly Christian. The impact of there wasn't this sense that that we need to support the British and the French because the Muslims are going to kill us. I mean, there is what Osama Maqdisi calls this spirit of ecumenical spirit between Muslims and Christians and Jews, well into Jews who are indigenous, quite well into the 1920. And so one of the questions that Osama asks is, why is it that Anatolia has a genocide and can't live with its minorities? And why is it that Arabs actually remain very, very much, Arab Christians remain very much part of the Nahda, of this Arab Renaissance and the embrace of their cultures and their communities?
Okay, I want to zoom a little forward a few centuries and talk about your second book project, or a later project, Iraq in Wartime. And so I'll ask you the first question, which is, in your mind, how connected are these two projects? I mean, how much did your understanding of the 16th century inform your understanding of Iraq in the 21st century? And obviously in the 90s as well.
I mean, I have to tell you, the project on Iraq in wartime, and when I thought about it, I had nothing. I didn't think at all of my early project. I was already well into writing a second book on 18th and 19th century Baghdad.
Yeah.
So this was a pure reaction to the American war on Iraq.
In 2003.
In 2003. And I had a deep knowledge of Iraq. I had an investment in its history and its people, but my reaction to the war in 2003 and how it was handled by the United States. This is a book project that began very soon after the invasion. In 2005, I started thinking about it. And I started thinking about it because I said, they can't do anything in Iraq. They went in there with this ideal or this sort of project, this completely wacko project of thinking, we're going to rebuild the nation of Iraq. But all right, you want to go build nations, you need to know a little bit about them. And one of the main things that I noticed is that they had policymakers had no interest, except for talking about Saddam Hussein's dictatorship and the weapons of mass destruction. They had no idea about the history of Iraq, the recent history of Iraq, the fact that Iraq had been at war for 23 years. By 2003, and that these wars had really transformed Iraqi society, and that they need to actually be cognizant of that and address what the implications of that are on their attempt to so-called nation building. So that's my reaction to it, 2003. Yeah. And so the other thing is that I was struck as I started thinking about this, is that being a child of the Lebanese Civil War and being married to a Palestinian whose society is being, racked by the colonial war, I thought that we need to actually address the issue of how war affects and transforms society, and the way, particularly, how we as people are changed by it and how we deal with it. And so that's how the project actually developed.
Well, let me just repeat that back to you. How does war transform and affect society, specifically in Iraq? I mean, you spent this time studying it. You have your own personal narrative, your personal perspective. But when you sat down and decided to actually investigate it rigorously from an academic perspective, what did you find, and what do you think people misunderstand about how war affects society?
I think perhaps getting back to you, the big question is, the sort of simple question, the answer is that war actually militarizes society, particularly men, and creates narrows the options available to people to think creatively beyond the boundaries and the limitations created by war. But to be more specific about it, it's we usually basically there's no routine in our lives, and this is the same as what Iraq is. It destroys your ability to think of life as routine. It also, in the case of Iraq, in the specific case of Iraq, mobilized huge sections of society and transformed in very meaningful ways the way women thought about themselves and the relationship to their families and to their country, and men thought about their masculinity and their ability to create, to go to jobs, and so on. So the book, in part, is based on my interviews with Iraqi soldiers. And so when I conceived of the book, part of my interest was to focus on men, because we mostly hear about, there's quite a bit of writing on the impact of war on women and their victimization and their coping mechanisms. But there's very little about men and how war transforms them. And because the Iraq-Iran war was this sort of very conventional war, these were soldiers going on the front. It wasn't a civil war. They're not gangs. They're not militias. These were upstanding citizens of the state. They went to colleges. They had jobs. And suddenly their life is disrupted and they're on the front for 8 years. It's the longest conventional war after World War I that the world had experienced by then. And so it's like the Vietnam War was for the United States. This is what we have for Iraq and Iran as well.
You know, a couple months ago, I was just, doing research, prepping for one of the interviews. I forget which one. And I was curious, what conflicts in the region had the most, were there the most casualties? And I think World War I is number one. And Iraq-Iran war was number two by a long shot. Number three is way down the line. I forget it. I even forget what number three is. And I thought to myself, it is amazing how little airtime this war gets. And not that it's a competition, but it's crazy to me, me sitting where I'm sitting right now, doing what I'm doing, how little time we spend talking about and exploring the ripples of that 8-year period. It's crazy. Why don't we talk about it more?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think I can sort of assess. So the Iran-Iraq war is iconic in the culture and film industry of Iran. I mean, and in the politics of Iran, most of the Revolutionary Guard had some making. Their young life started in the Iran-Iraq war. It's a huge thing, and it's huge because it is extremely important for Iranian nationalism and for the kind of Islamic Republic nationalism so it's very strange that we don't have the same thing for Iraq. And the Iran-Iraq war, there are 400,000, as well in the first Gulf War, 400,000 Iraqi men, mostly Iraqi men, died. That's every single Iraqi family lost one or two people, or not more, in the Iran-Iraq war, as well as the Gulf War. And I think part of why we don't make a big fuss about it is because, or we haven't studied it, is because, to be blunt with you, the scholarship on the Levant, is overcome with, overcome with its own problems and its own wars. But there's this disconnect between the study of Iraq from the study of the Levant. The second reason, I think, is that the Iraqis themselves don't have a consensus about the war. I mean, during the war, the Ba'ath Party and Saddam's regime gassed the Kurds, and because they were rebelling against them against the war and cooperating with the Iranians in some time. And also there were significant portions of the population of Iraq in the areas bordering Iran that were sympathetic with Islamic parties such as the Dawa Party, and which now went back to ruling Iraq, as well as the Islamic other Islamic parties who were cooperating with Iran. So, and they viewed these parties, and the Kurds thought of this as not a national war. This is a Ba'athist war. This is Saddam's war. And so now you have these memorializations and these cults of martyrdom, and nobody talks about the men who lost their lives in the Iran-Iraq war because it's not a national war. This doesn't happen in Iran.
It's very, very interesting. It's something I definitely want to explore more. I want to move on to your current work, which is a subject. It's funny, when I first reached out to you, I'll explain to the listeners, when I first reached out to you, it was about everything we just spoke about. And that's why I was excited to talk to you. And then you said, Mikey, I'm working on this new book project related to passports. And I got so excited because this is a subject that affects me and affects everyone around me, most people around me. And I got, over the last 2 years, more than that, 4 years, I've been really, really curious about the history of passports and when this institution, this paper document, became introduced globally, but specifically in this region, since the nation states are relatively new, and these are national documents. So let me ask you a really basic question to start us off. When were the first passports issued in what we think of as the Arab world, or documents like passports?
I think the closest, I think maybe the 1870s or the Ottoman Empire. And when I talk about the Ottoman Empire, I'm really talking about mostly the Levant and what is now known as Turkey and part of the Balkans. In the 1880s, the Ottoman nationality law was actually was created. Was written in 1869, and it was written specifically to figure out not to give us or to give Ottomans citizenship or nationality, all of them, but it was basically thought of as an attempt to control these people in the Ottoman Empire who were mostly minorities, who were saying, okay, we are, Ottoman when we choose to be, but really we want to be protected by the British or the French. And every certain transaction that took place, they would appeal to the consul of the France or the French. And so the Ottomans said, okay, I am going to issue this law and to my Ottoman subjects and say, you have to choose. You cannot be one of two. So it is in this context that we experience, the first passports were issued in the Ottoman Empire, but really they don't take off until the 1880s and 1890s. And this is when, particularly from Lebanon, and eventually people from what is historic Syria begin immigrating en masse to the New World and into Europe. And these subjects of the empire are claiming their properties, continue to claim their properties in the Ottoman Empire. And at the same time insist on that they are protected by particularly the United States or European countries and so on. And this is when they begin issuing passports. That's the Ottoman. This is, we're talking about the Levant.
Are there IDs before that? Are there identification documents that everyone has, but this idea of I need a pass for ports to enter and exit ports. I need a thing that is specifically designed to allow me to traverse borders. But were there documents, identification documents that were issued by the...
Yes, definitely. I mean, remember when I said the 1860s and 70s, they begin creating sort of statistics and censuses and modernizing. And part of what every Ottoman had to carry, particularly as well in what is known as Anatolia and the Levant, less so in my neck of the woods, Iraq, and is something called, if you know Arabic, it's called in Ottoman Turkish Murur Tezkeresi, which is a Tezkeret Mururi. And what it had was your name, very rarely initially as a picture, but your name, where you're from, and the color of your skin. Amhave was lots for our, and then basically putting you, allowing the state to see you. Basically, think about it this way: as beyond that, before that, you could go from one place to another without having to carry. This allows the state, as you as an individual, to be seen by the state.
Yeah, it's like making an account on NewYorkTimes.com. You're allowed, now we know who you are. Yes. We know what you're reading. Before you
where
got to read it without an account, now you have to have an account.
they couldn't do that at that time, but but I suspect that's the closest analogy. I mean, that's one analogy we could follow. Now they can see where we're going, and then they embroider us all in paperwork. I mean, this is the beginning of huge bureaucracies in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And endless paperwork.
And endless paperwork. So your project, from what I understand, focuses on the Gulf, on Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, southern Iran. What is unique about that neck of the woods, so to speak, that isn't true in the Levant, in Egypt and Anatolia?
I think, let me start with what is common. I think the whole move to begin controlling the movement of people, and not controlling, regulating, let's put it, regulating the people and controlling and deciding who's in and who's out, begins in the late 19th century globally. And this has a lot to do with the fact that people can travel more and quicker from one place to the other. And it also has to do with the fact that this is a time of tremendous imperial rivalries between Europe, the various European imperial states, and increasingly the Ottomans by the late 19th century, and eventually the Qajars who controlled Iran. So in the context of tremendous increase in mobility because of new technologies that are developing for moving people, but it's in the context of increasing expansion of European power, land power, territorial control all over the world, from India to Asia to India to the Middle East and Africa. Now, what makes this area that I'm focused on unique in all of this is that it had three more major empires competing in this very small, narrow space, which is the Persian Gulf. But we need to see the Persian Gulf not as we see it now, as this sort of small sea with awfully rich countries, but actually as part of East Africa, what is known as Western Indian world. And it still is. If you come where I am in Qatar now, it's very much part of East Africa and India.
Yeah, the Omani legacy.
Yes, and so there's has been lots of mobility for a long time, and it is in this relatively narrow space that we have these empires competing in the Persian Gulf. We have the Ottoman Empire, which at that time had sovereignty over Kuwait, Basra, and what is known as Ihfa, which is Eastern Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And you had the Qajar dynasty, which is Persian, that had its ambitions and made claims to the Shiite and southern Iraq, and that had interest in parts of southern Iraq, as well as Bahrain, and you had, of course, the Ottomans, and then you had the British, who had bases in Zanzibar and Oman, and had contracted a number of treaties with what is now known United Arab Emirates, was based in Bahrain as well, and had treaties eventually with the Sheikh, with Kuwait.
Yeah.
So it is in this narrow space that these empires started competing on issues of which of these people, or competing about people and the mobility of people, because they could claim, for example, that once I have a sovereignty over a person, I can make territorial claims. I can claim sovereignty over a territory. So to give you give this what I'm talking about, some solidity, and give you some examples. So in the late 19th century, because of steam navigation, you had a tremendous amount of Indian subjects of the British Empire and the subjects of the Raj come to the Persian Gulf as traders, as pilgrims. Some settled and became extremely important in the economies of these regions. And so if a pilgrim died, if a merchant wanted to settle a debt with a local, he could claim, or they could claim, that the British were responsible for them. They were responsible, so they would go to a consulate that exists in one of these tutorial states, as well as Basra or in Iran, in the city of Bushehr, and say, I'm a subject of the British Raj. You need to protect me because I have a case against another merchant who is a local. And in this sense, then he would say, I need a document that proves. You need a document that proves that you're a subject of the debt. The same happens with the Ottomans, who were very upset by this and said, you cannot just claim sovereignty over the states because you need to claim sovereignty over people. So that this becomes an issue between these states, and the document becomes the proof of protection of one power or the other. And that's how passports begin becoming important, and documents.
Because there is this presumption that if you're a subject, and if you're a subject of one empire, you can you demand the protection of that empire.
Yes.
And by demanding the protection of one, you obviously can't be the subject of another.
Yes. And, to give you a particular example, for example, so pilgrims from Afghanistan, there's the story of one pilgrim from Afghanistan who lands, who goes to Palestine to visit the holy places in Palestine. He gets stranded. He has no money to go back to Afghanistan. So he goes to the British consul and says, I want you to take me back to Afghanistan because I'm a subject of the British Empire. But the Ottoman Sultan says, no, Afghanistan is not legally a subject of the Ottoman Empire, of the British Empire. This guy is a Muslim. He is a subject of ours. He can stay here. And so it becomes an issue of what is known as jurisdictional politics, i.e., who has jurisdiction over this guy, legal and legal rights over this guy. And then documents become, and of course, there's a series of documents that develop out of this.
Can I ask you about one particular document that is iconic at this point, and limits movement? When did the institution of the visa emerge?
I think it emerges actually in the early 20th century, and it never takes off. It never takes off because there's so much confusion on the part of the British, not only the Ottomans. The British are going, what is a visa? What do we issue it? So we think of these governments, of imperial governments, as these sort of well-oiled machines. Nobody knows what they're doing. This is so new. You know what I mean? And so it begins developing in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it develops in the context of how long does the person who is resident can move from let's say from Kuwait to Bahrain. Does he need it? And he's a subject of, let's say, the Ottoman Empire in the 1880s. Does he need a visa to go to Bahrain? Or this sort of thing developed, and the visa never takes off. Actually, the whole regime of passports is not only institutionalized and becomes part of international law by the League of Nations in 1924. Initially, until then, everybody's trying to figure it out. So, despite the fact that passports initially are thought of as documents that limit mobility, they because there were so many, the people were so inept, and they were just trying to figure out what the situation was. You could move quite easily and get around this, and there were lots of fake papers being done at that time. But I mean, I think in terms of an example that stands out to me, that maybe that can make it sort of tangible for your audiences, is when I first began to be interested in this subject. It's because I was studying the implementation of the nationality law in Iraq in 1827. And I was focused primarily on this case of a tribe that lived in southern Iran, southern Iraq. It's a clan that moved from one area to the other. And these were open borders, although the Ottomans and the Persians had tried to limit them, but they remained open borders, as they do right now as well, actually. So the British said, you have to decide in 1827, are you Iranian or Iraqi? These guys had spent their lifetime cultivating land in Iraq, what is now Iraq, and going back home to Khuzestan to sleep because they were members of the tribe of the ruler of Khuzestan. And so when they were given this paper, this form to fill out to take a passport and a nationality, they asked them, are you Iraqi or Iranian? You can't move anymore. They said, what are you talking about? We actually owe our allegiance to the Sheikh Kaab, of the Kaab. This is who we are. The concept of nationality was very, very alien to them. And then the passport, they had to sign a passport. They had to make a choice. And then now they're Iranians or Iraqi. So the passport has power, the form and to limit our movement, and sort of takes like a fetish. It becomes a fetish. It takes a life of its own.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask you the quick Q&A because somehow we're out of time. So let's do the rapid fire questions and then we'll wrap up. The first question is, what are you reading or watching these days?
I am reading a book on migration. That's great fun, about Egyptian migrants to the Gulf. That's beautifully done because it's done in the form of stories. And I hope to be able to write a book that's centered around stories and not very academic.
Do you remember the name, just in case we want to look it up?
It's called, actually, it's very, very lovely. It's called Migrant Dreams. Migrants' Dreams. And it's, focused about the dreams of migrant workers from Egypt in the Gulf. And it's very, very accessible and wonderful.
Great.
What I'm watching, I wish I could tell you I'm watching junk.
No judgment. You're allowed.
The last thing I watched was, what is it? What's the movie that everybody's talking about now about a Jewish...
You People with Eddie Murphy.
You People.
It's excellent.
I just watched You People.
Me too. I watched it last night.
You did, yes.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm watching.
Great. Okay. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Oh, in the past?
Yeah, sure.
I would have loved to shadow Baryshnikov.
Cool.
So because I love his dancing and I love his theatricality.
Sure. Yeah. Great choice. What do people most misunderstand about your work?
I don't think people read enough of there are enough people who read my work to misunderstand it, Mickey.
So they don't understand what they're missing.
They don't understand what they're missing. I'm not sure, but I think that's my answer.
Yeah. And the last question is, whose work do you admire or are inspired by? Outside of your profession, I'm sure there's a million scholars who you admire and are inspired by, but outside of scholarship, whose work do you gives you inspiration?
Where do I start? I think Miles Davis.
Great choice. Yeah, me too.
In jazz and in painting. That's primarily because I just came from an exhibit there. There's this painter that's who does powerful work. His name is Lucien Freud. And so that's very inspiring because it's got solidity and it doesn't lie and it says it as it is.
Amazing. I want to ask you one last question about Iraq, okay?
Mm-hmm.
We always hear things, or I always hear things on the news that Iraq is a failed project and this is really 3 different states and 3 different societies, or maybe 4, or maybe 5, or maybe 10, or maybe 12, and that the fragmentation is undeniable and is anyone who doesn't see it is naive or uninformed. And from your perspective as somebody who has taken the long view and spent time thinking about the last few centuries, what is your immediate reaction to people when they say stuff like that?
My immediate reaction is, well, yes, it's a failed state, but it didn't fail because its people made it fail. You know what I mean? There was a project, maybe the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein and his policies didn't help, particularly after 1991. But the destruction of Iraq as a society and as a country was brought on Iraq with violence and environmental catastrophes were created. So it is a failed state, but it didn't fail on its own. And it was a state that failed because there was an invasion and it was blown apart. And is there hope for Iraq? It's not for me to say, but I can tell you something. There's a new generation of Iraqis that is trying to work outside this fragmentation of sect and tribe that exists in Iraq, and trying to create a new culture. I don't know how the extent to they would be successful, but I would say it's the same as the new generation of Lebanese who are trying to change what's going on in Lebanon. But the odds are huge against them. I mean, and it's going to take some time. But in the case of Iraq, we need to remember this happened because the sanctions of 13-year sanctions embargo was horrendous in its impact on the ability of Iraqis to survive. And then comes this war. So that's, I think, what we need to keep in mind.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your time and your perspective. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to be able to speak to you about this.
Thank you for having me.